Alright, today I'm going to review the SIRUI 35mm 1.4 lens, which I've been using for the last couple of weeks with my Sony ZV-E1. But before I start, I do want to mention that SIRUI did send me this lens completely for free in exchange of making this video. That said, let's start with the price. So the price for this lens is only $550, but SIRUI also gave me a 5% off discount code to share with you guys, which will reduce the overall price to $523. And this is significantly cheaper than the Sony 35mm 1.4 GM or the Sigma 35mm 1.4 Mark II. But now let's see if it's worth the price in terms of like the overall design features and also the optical performance. So first of all, in terms of like the build quality, everything feels absolutely premium and fantastic. The lens itself is made of metal and feels extremely premium. The only thing that is plastic is the lens hood, but it is super easy to mount. Everything feels really premium, smooth, and robust. And I would say one of the main selling points of this lens is, as you can see, it is extremely compact. I would say just as compact as the GM 35mm 1.4 from Sony, but also it is extremely lightweight, weighing only 491 grams on its own, and 527 grams with the lens hood, which I believe is actually slightly lighter than the 35mm 1.4 GM from Sony. So if you're looking for something ultra compact and lightweight with a f1.4 aperture, this might be something worth considering. Now, in terms of lens features, first of all, in here you have weather sealing, like a rubber gasket. Then you also get all the necessary switches and buttons, an autofocus manual focus switch, a custom clicky function button, an iris lock to basically lock the aperturing, and also you get a click on and off switch to switch from like the smooth aperturing and then clicked aperturing. The aperturing feels very tactile, premium, but if you don't like the sound, you can switch it to click off, then it's going to be pretty much silent. And then the filter thread size is 62mm. And also here on the back, you have a USB-C port for firmware updates, which I actually did with this lens. I had to update the firmware. And then in terms of like the manual focus ring, it is extremely smooth. Nothing makes any squeaks or noises, but I did test the focus throw and it is pretty short. It's about, I would say, 30 to 35 degrees, something like that, which is okay for photography if you want to quickly switch from like close to infinity focus. But for video, I wish it was a bit, longer, because you want those slow and smooth transitions basically when manually focusing from like close to infinity. All right, before I move on to autofocus, I just want to mention that I just switched to the SIRUI 35mm 1.4 lens from my TT Artisan 40mm f2, and I'm shooting wide open at f1.4, but I had to use a bit of clear image zoom on my camera to kind of match the focal length of the 40mm in here. So hopefully you can kind of see how this lens performs in the studio, wide open again, and I'm going to use this lens for the rest of the video basically as my talking head lens. Regardless, now let's talk about the autofocus performance. So I did a couple of tests, and in my opinion, the autofocus performance of this lens is fantastic. I didn't notice any noticeable issues with autofocus. Only sometimes when I backlit myself, I saw the lens hesitating a little bit when it comes to grabbing the focus quickly, but honestly, it happens also with like native Sony lenses, because when you're shooting in challenging conditions, it's a bit harder for the lens to properly autofocus basically. So overall, I would say the autofocus on this lens is really snappy, really quick, significantly quicker than something like this 40mm f2 from TT Artisan. But if you're going to shoot in challenging lighting conditions, do expect that sometimes it can like slightly hunt or like pulse, if you will. All right, and now moving on to the focus breathing performance. I think this lens performs pretty okay. It is not perfect like the Sony 35mm 1.8 lens. You will see some breathing obviously with this lens, and unfortunately you can't use the focus breathing compensation feature on newer Sony cameras with this lens because it only supports native Sony lens. But it is not terrible. The focus breathing performance of this lens is not that terrible, but maybe if you're doing focus pulling or focus stacking shots, you might want to consider a different lens if you want it to be as perfect as possible. And in terms of like the minimum focus distance, this lens has a minimum focus distance of 35 centimeters, which again is not really that impressive, but at least the image is tack sharp in the center. Like you won't notice any difference between a minimum focus distance and like infinity focus, because with some lenses this is an issue, but with this lens it is going to be tack sharp at the minimum focus distance, although the minimum focus distance is not that impressive at 35 centimeters. All right, now let's take a look at the optical performance of this lens. I shot a couple of tests to show you how this lens performs in the real world. So first of all, let's start with like sharpness tests to see how sharp this lens is and also if it exhibits any distortions and whatnot. So here I have an image from with an f1.4 aperture, f1.8, f2.8 and f4. Let's zoom into the center. And as you can see in the center at f1.4, it is really sharp. At f1.8, it is slightly sharper and with more contrast, but the f1.4 image in the center is not soft by any means. I would say at f2.8, you get, the best sharpness performance because it does not improve significantly from f2.8 to like f4. Let's go to the top. Also, f1.4 is pretty sharp, a bit blurry in here. The contrast is a bit lost. At f1.8, the contrast is better, the sharpness is better, but not significantly. And then at f2.8, it is, significantly sharper than f1.4. Now let's go to the corner. Right corner, still plenty sharp in the corner as you can see at f1.4. At f1.8 it looks more or less the same if I'm honest, but at f2.8 there is a big difference between that image and f1.4 image. And at f4 for whatever reason it looks a bit softer. Maybe I missed the focus, I'm not really sure, but honestly it's not too bad. Now let's move on to the other side in here. Alright, so here we have a bit of blur going on with the f1.4 image and also a bit of like soft low contrast. At f1.8 the contrast improves and also the sharpness improves, and at f2.8 it becomes significantly better. But again, it might be that I missed focus, if you will, because if I'm gonna go in here to the lower left corner, right, the performance is a bit better in the corner in here. Maybe the f1.8 is slightly better, but it's not as significant as the top left corner. Now let me zoom out, and in terms of like distortion, maybe there is a bit of like barrel distortion, but it's barely noticeable, honestly. I can barely see any distortion issues. And in terms of vignetting as well, it performs really well. There is barely any vignetting. Maybe there's some in here, right? And also in here. But it's really well controlled in my personal opinion, considering the compact form factor of this lens. And by the way, I shot this with a 3:2 aspect ratio. Basically the widest aspect ratio possible. Here is another sample from outdoors, f1.4, 1.8, 2.8 and f4. Let's zoom in. As you can see, it is incredibly sharp at f1.4 in the center. Barely any difference in the real world when comparing, the f1.4 and f1.8. You can barely notice any difference. It is significantly sharper though at f2.8 as you can see in here, but the overall performance, honestly, at f1.4 is really good. All right, let's move on in here. This is the minimum focus distance performance, f1.4, 1.8, 2.8, and f4. And like I told you last time, as you can see, even at f1.4, the sharpness performance at the minimum focus distance is fantastic. Yes, it does improve at f1.8 slightly, it becomes a bit sharper, but the overall contrast and sharpness and bite is phenomenal even at like f1.4. All right, now let's move on to chromatic aberration tests. And here I show this, against the light basically to stress the lens as much as possible. And as you can see, it does have some chromatic aberration issues when shooting wide open. And at f1.8 it improves only slightly if I'm honest. There is barely any difference. But at f2.8, it goes away quite significantly, but it's still somewhat noticeable. And I would say, considering the lighting conditions in here, I was shooting right against the sun, I think the performance is really good. It is not that noticeable. It is super easy to fix in something like Lightroom or DaVinci Resolve and whatnot. All right, now let's take a look at the flare performance, contrast performance, and also sunstars. This is f1.4 again, f1.8, 2.8, and f4. And as you can see, first of all, the contrast of this lens is fantastic. There's barely any difference in terms of like the overall contrast between f1.4 and f4, which is incredible considering I have this light shining directly at the lens basically. So in terms of like overall contrast, it is really good even shooting wide open. Now, there is some like flares in here as you can see, like this red, green, and blue flares. at f1.4 and also f1.8, and then at f2.8 it improves significantly, but it is not too distracting in my personal opinion. It looks kind of flattering if I'm honest. And now let's move on to higher apertures to see the sunstars. This is f5.6, f8, f11, and f16. And as you can see, the sunstars also look really clean with like high contrast to the image, which is pretty cool. Let me just zoom in for you guys so you can kind of see how the sunstars perform. There is some like a red and green flare going on in here, as you can see, even at like f16. But it is still relatively clean in my personal opinion. All right, and now let's take a look at the background blur, bokeh, and also minimum focus distance, if you will. This is f1.4, 1.8, f2.8, f4, and as you can see, even at f1.4, it is pretty sharp. And then in terms of like bokeh, as you can see, you get this kind of a bokeh at f1.4, like cat eye shaped bokeh, with some fringing around the bokeh balls. Right, there is some fringing going on, but also this was like a reflective surface, if you will, so maybe it will add to the fringing a bit. And then at f1.8, as you can see, the bokeh balls become more rounded, if you will, and a bit cleaner when it comes to like fringing. Here is another comparison. I basically took a picture of my TV, if you will, with some star backgrounds to kind of imitate Christmas lights, if you will. And again, you get this like oval shaped bokeh at f1.4, and then at f1.8, the bokeh becomes more rounded. And this is f2.8, obviously, and then f4. And then in here, I wanted to see how well it isolates the subject from the background when doing like a full body shot, if you will. And as you can see, there is a massive difference between f1.4 and then f1.8. In terms of like the background blur, I'm more isolated in the f1.4 image from the background than the f1.8 image. So if you want to do like full body shots, basic like portraits, full body portraits, the f1.4 aperture comes in really handy, especially at this like somewhat of a wide focal length, because usually the wider the focal length, the more, you know, the lower the aperture will have to be if you want to really isolate the subject from the background. As you can see, it like f2.8, I'm almost like flat with the background, but in here the image looks significantly more interesting because of that low aperture, if you will. Another thing that I forgot to mention is that out of camera, as you can see, without adjusting the colors at all, this lens has a pretty neutral and cool tint going on, which reminds me a lot of like Zeiss lenses. These lenses that I've tried in the past from Zeiss had like a really muted, cooler tone baked into the image basically. And this lens is kind of similar. It's definitely not on the warm side. It's more like blue and green by default basically. So if you like that, you might enjoy this lens as well. All right, so to summarize, I think this SIRUI 35mm 1.4 lens, which I'm using right now with my Sony ZV-E1, is fantastic for the price of only $523 if you use the code in here through the link down below. Maybe it's not going to be as good as the Sony 35mm 1.4 GM, but the GM lens is significantly more expensive than this SIRUI lens in here. For only $523 with this lens, you get fantastic build quality, compact and lightweight design, great autofocus performance, and most importantly, fantastic optical performance at the same time. So if you're looking for something compact, lightweight with an f1.4 aperture without, you know, spending a lot of money, this is definitely something worth considering. I actually had the SIRUI 85mm 1.4 in the past, which I bought myself actually, and I had to sell it because the minimum focus distance was a bit far, but other than that, the overall package was fantastic, especially considering the price. So if you are interested, link is going to be down below, and if you have any questions or comments, also post them down below. And I guess I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.